Thanks so much, everybody, for having accepted this invitation, and we were very thrilled about this event. And what we will do and discuss here obviously connects quite well to what we discussed in the previous panel. We had this discussion about chips. We will talk about vertical value chains and value chain constellations and regulatory problems that might emerge from that and what that exactly means. Let me briefly introduce the panelists to you. So Ela Glowicka, she's a director of ECA Economics, our sponsor. Thanks very much again. She's an economist with over 15 years of experience in economic analysis in the context of European competition policy and private litigation, from her roles in economic consulting, enforcement, but also academia. Before joining ECA, you were at the European Commission in the chief competition economist team at DG Competition. So thanks so much for being here. And you having this empirical economics perspective, as we also saw from your contribution. Jason Potts, professor of economics at RMIT University, co-director of the Blockchain Innovation Hub there, and also chief investigator on the ARC Center of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making in Society. In his often interdisciplinary work, Jason has a wide range of interests, including growth theory, creative industries, economics of cities, innovation commons, and crypto economics and blockchain more recently. Thanks so much for coming here from Australia. This is great. Paul Seabright, professor of economics at the Toulouse School of Economics. In his research, he combines a wide range of areas: microeconomic theory, industrial and competition policy, intellectual property, and digital society, and the economics of gender and of religion. And I may quote from your website, a common theme to these apparently chaotically diverse topics is the foundation of human cooperation and social trust. So it all makes sense, obviously. You examine in particular the way in which our prehistorically evolved psychology interacts with modern institutions to make social cooperation possible. Paul, thanks so much for joining us today. And my dear friend here, William Lair, Bill, I will refer to you as Bill, of course. He's a research scientist at the MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, CSAIL. And he's also an affiliated researcher in my research group at the Weizenbaum Institute. He's an economist, an expert on telecommunications and internet industry with more than 25 years of experience. He often provides advice to senior industry executives and policymakers in the US, but also abroad. Great to have you here, Bill. Now, regarding the session structure, we will have a session that is closely basically relating, of course, similar with what Thibault just moderated. And so we would start with opening statements, opening remarks from all of you. I give you 5 minutes, a bit longer than Thibault, a bit more generous. Well, I might not be that more generous when we talk about the bonus questions. I may be, but I may be not. So after these intro opening statements, I would ask some questions to delve a bit deeper into the aspects you covered in your contributions for the network law review. This is basically should provide us all then a good foundation for further discussion. So I would ask you to make your opening statements, and we will refer to the alphabetical order of names, starting with Ela.
Thanks a lot. Big thanks to Thibault and Volker for organizing this great event. Thanks for having us as sponsors. Thanks for having me as a speaker in this panel. I just want to mention that my contribution is joint work with Jan Malek, sitting right there. And as an economic consultant, I want to make a disclaimer that I don't work for any of the companies that we are talking about. Okay, let's start. We have, in the last 1.5 years, we have seen the birth of generative AI technology, generative AI products, and at the same time, we have seen competition authorities in panic because they see the big tech incumbents going into this market, and they are worried that this will be again a very difficult story, difficult case for competition enforcement of Article 102, which everyone agrees, or many people agree, has failed severely in case of digital industry. And therefore, there have even been votes, opinions expressed that actually one has to be very careful with market power itself. And maybe if we cannot act on the abuse of market power, maybe we should just prevent the existence of market power. And this is something where we were really stuck by this kind of statements. And so we were asking ourselves questions. What is it really the case that you should worry about market power just for its existence? Or maybe there are just economic forces, economic characteristics of this industry, which are simply prone to market power. Market power has to be there for some reasons. And as a corollary, if you want, you could see that companies cooperate vertically. For example, the cooperation of Microsoft and OpenAI. And there are good reasons for this to be happening. So we were looking into really evidence and facts, and this is something you can find in our contribution. What do we find? We find high fixed cost to enter this market and also to operate in this market. And it's not only at the level of creating and training large language models, it's also at the level of the cloud services which are needed for this to operate and to train large language models. And it's also at the level of chip manufacturing. So there is high fixed costs. There are economies of scale and scope. If you are big, you can do it cheaper and you can do it better. And this is both in the dimension of computing power, but also in terms of data that is needed to train models. The third economic force are network effects. Network effects at the level of large language models, where adoption and improvement are working together in a positive feedback loop. But there are also network effects in the sense of large language models increasing utility from other services which are available in the same ecosystem. So large language models are complementary to other services. And finally, the fourth important force, market force that was important to us are capacity constraints in chip manufacturing. This is something we already heard in the comment from Paul in the previous session. At the moment, NVIDIA has market share of in the range of 80–90%, and there is not enough chips to serve the demand. We have to see how this develops, but this also has consequences for how the vertical chain of generative AI market works. So having identified these four forces, what do we find? We find that companies in the vertical value chain organize themselves, work together vertically, and organize themselves into vertical stacks. And Anouk already mentioned this a little bit, that we have companies cooperating from the chip, at the level of chip manufacturing, with cloud providers, with AI foundation model developers, and finally, at the closest level to the user, we have developers of AI applications. And that one is maybe less integrated, but AI models, AI foundation models, cloud service providers, and chip manufacturers, they work together vertically. And we found at the moment in the Western economy, we can see 5 of such vertical stacks. They organize themselves around 4 big digital incumbents: Google, Meta, Amazon, and Microsoft. And then we also have the chip manufacturer, NVIDIA, investing into AI foundation models directly. So there are 5 such ecosystems, vertical ecosystems, that compete with each other, and each of them has a slightly different business strategy. Meta has an open source idea. NVIDIA doesn't have the cloud services. The other 3 have active in the cloud services, but they come with a big market power in other digital markets. And here they all meet. So we have 5 big, powerful companies that all meet in this one market. And these ecosystems compete with each other, and they have the fact that they are big and powerful, it has important implications. For example, they are able to alleviate financial constraints of large language model developers who usually start as a small startup, but at some point they need the money to scale up. Without scaling up, without big investment, they are not going to make it. And this is something that big digital incumbents can provide. The big digital incumbents can also provide the scale and the scope which are needed to lower the cost and increase the quality. And finally, because there is a competition between those 5 stacks, but at the frontier to the user, we have a very differentiated and many small application developers. These vertical stacks have incentives to pass on any efficiencies that are created higher in the value chain down to the consumer, because they have to fight for the developers of applications. And now the final sentence. So we have to see what is going to happen in the future. The future is still to come. But today we see fierce competition which brings innovation. Every second day we hear about new products, new services. And we think it's a good thing. It's a welcome development.
Thank you very much, Ela, and also Jan for the contribution for the NLR. Truly appreciate, enjoyed reading it, and truly appreciate the detail you provided and the range of evidence you collected. Thus, of course, providing a substantiation to a lot of stuff we will discuss today and, of course, in other contexts. Thank you. Jason, the floor is yours. Can you pass on the microphone?
Yeah, thanks, Volker. So I've got a slightly different perspective on this, just because of the background I've come from. So I work on economics of innovation and institutions, and the starting point here was what type of institutions for production and consumption is Gen AI? Like, what's, is this just a normal industry, standard industry that we've seen before, or is there something weird and new going on here? My answer is weird and new. But the sort of, starting fact number 1, Gen AI is mostly produced in the commons. However, there are some very, very large companies. Those companies are very, very large for the same reason that the railways companies were very, very large. It's just a huge amount of capital is involved to do the, to buy all the hardware to do the training. But the technology stack, where you go machine learning algorithms, which is knowledge, which is from universities, which is distributed, and a bunch of geniuses around the world sort of more or less came together and figured it out over an 80-year period. Then suddenly Jeff Hinton, came down from heaven and did the thing. The training data in the commons, mostly. Lawyers can argue about, is it really, but mostly it is. It was either stolen from the public domain, or it was actually in the commons, or whatever. The models, these are just massive matrices that are made of numbers and digital sort of things. They're kind of in the commons. I mean, you can steal them. They leak out very easily. So they're kind of IP protected, but kind of not really. Most of the skills about how you use them are in the labor markets that are just drifting around, and I can just hire someone away, and contract law can a little bit protect you, but again, not really. So there's this kind of de facto sort of, and then the models that build on top of the foundation models, the apps, as it were. Again, where are they? Well, they're not licensed completely. They're, again, kind of a little bit licensed-ish, but they're not really. I can easily steal one, download it to my phone, run off to another country, and it's mine, effectively, right? So I'm sort of distinguishing between what the law actually says and what happens in practice. Is that, circa 2024, most of those models are in the wild. Are they meant to be? No. They're meant to be protected inside companies and locked down and so on. Are they in practice? No. Llama's aggressively pushing them into the commons. I've got a bunch of them on my device that are mine now, effectively. The parameter sets don't get updated because I don't have the license. But at some point, these things are effectively in the wild. Now, the word I'm going to use is that they're on the edges. They have escaped from the center of the firms that produced them, and they are now effectively in the wild and are being built upon. All right, so what is that? What that means is that what we have is a technology that is sort of this hybrid of large corporate ownership and control and governance, combined with network distribution, combined with the inputs, the data sets, skilled labor, apps that are doing it mostly in the commons. All right, so competition. And now let's talk about competition. And we're talking about competition in the context, I don't think the right framing is small number of very large corporations that we can regulate as if they were steel companies or railway companies, and just, we know where they are, we know who owns them, we know who the shareholders are, we can write some laws to control them. That's aspirational, but the reality is that most of the competition is going to come from innovation, dynamic capabilities. That innovation is mostly going to come from the commons. Now, some of it will come from the large corporations because they have very, very smart people working there, that they're highly incentivized to create new things. But the most interesting types of innovation that we're going to see is not innovation in a new parameter set, a new foundation model. Those things are more or less in the wild now. The real innovation is in use cases. I could use this stripped down foundation model that is now a specified app for this particular thing, and I can use it for this, and I can embed it in my company or my work practices or my whatever, a complementary resource, and I'm going to use it for this, and that's going to create value. Bang. Innovation. That, when we think about what is the value of this technology, most of that value comes from the discovery of new use cases and the embedding of those new use cases into the economy. Almost all of that is going to take place in the commons. So what that means then is, I think, the sort of Schumpeterian creative destruction model of of entrepreneurial corporations doing the innovation and creating the value, and competition being understood in terms of that. That's clearly going on. But my argument is, and I'll take the extreme case, that's a second order effect. The main effect is at the user end. Someone mentioned right at the start, the main users of AI right now is in secret, inside companies, where a worker is just trying to automate their own job and not telling anyone. That's by far the main use case and value creating case. Expect that to continue. What is that? That's a commons inside a firm. What's the firm's management problem? How do I discover what you're doing and tell the other workers so that we can compete with your new discovery? So what I want to emphasize is that this discovery problem, this knowledge discovery problem, is the main sort of thing that is driving innovation, which in turn is driving competitive disruption. What kind of regulatory framework do we then need for that? We need one that is consistent with not messing that up, right? So this is, Gen AI is software. It's math, basically, but it's math encoded in software. What is the big lesson we've learned in the last 40 years about software is the best way to produce software is not the Microsoft way, It is the open source way. You get the best software that way. You get it faster, cheaper, more robust. It's the Linux way. The same thing is happening to Gen AI, even though these fixed costs are real and measured in numbers that start with B, and if we believe Sam, T, right? Even though there are these massive fixed costs and this appearance of monopoly power in terms of the production of the underlying thing, my point is that it escapes so quickly into the wild, and the value generation is then kicking through that the real question is, how do we design regulatory frameworks to facilitate the creation and deployment and discovery and of the effective uses of Gen AI. So that's what I mean by that then is that the relevant framework here is user innovation, not producer innovation. The gospel here is the gospel of Eric von Hippel, not Dick Nelson and Sidney Winter. They're still correct, but they're not. That's not the main effect. And going forward, this is a global phenomena. If you don't like EU regulations, just go somewhere else. If you don't like American capital, just find it somewhere else, right? It's just like the world of sort of competitive federalism is real here. The main users of Gen AI will be exactly where the people are, which is Asia, right? And which industries? All of them. Which jobs? All of them. There is no meaningful sectoral approach or regional approach to this new tech, and that's kind of new. It's not completely new because the internet was like that as well. But a lot of the other technologies that did have this property, railways, steel, and so on, were very clearly in countries. You could very clearly see which industries they affected. Utterly not true this time. And I think a lot of the our regulatory thinking hasn't quite caught up with that insight. So that's a sort of high-level sort of take I want to make, which is, I'm overstating it for dramatic effect, but my point here is that even though it looks like small number of mega corporations and we're worried about control of Skynet because of Sam, I think that's not the point. The real issue here is discovery of the uses of this incredible new technology. And my bet is we've seen, maybe we can intuit among ourselves, maybe 1% of them right now. Even some of the smartest people in the world in this room. Most of us cannot figure out what the actual use cases will be. And that they will be discovered, not intuited from that. So the economic context of this is the economic context of discovery. The previous mechanisms that economists advise for, what are the best mechanisms for discovery? Markets. Markets require property rights over things. What I think is the best mechanism for discovery here is the commons. Therefore, what we need is regulatory environments that are geared toward the protection of the commons and not harming the commons. It's not about subsidizing it, it's about not ruining it. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I think your focus already shows the complementarity of perspectives we're bringing here together. And I found this very inspiring. And we will discuss this in more detail, but if I understand correctly, you also coined the concept of hyper capabilities in your NLR contribution, right?
Yes. So look, that was Sam.
We appreciate this tremendously.
Okay. Yeah. Can I just say quickly one sentence on that? So look, many of us will know the sort of David Teese concept of dynamic capabilities, and the significance of that is that's your target for competition policy. If you're a competition regulator and you believe in the one true economics, evolutionary economics, then dynamic capabilities are the thing that you have to see and pay attention to. My point is, dynamic capabilities are things that exist in firms. A firm has or does not have or invests in dynamic capabilities. I've just made the case that it's not firms, that it's commonses, right? But the insight, there are some capabilities that are still there that we need, that competition needs to protect, needs to see, identify, and protect is still true. So we need a name for those. I've called them hyper capabilities, like hypertext and hyper whatever. But what it just means is that there is a type of dynamic capability that does not exist inside a firm, but is real. It exists across a bunch of users, consumers, innovators there. And that's the target of competition policy, is that new concept. So I'm just trying to extend David Ties's insight to a non-firm world.
Thanks very much. Can you take this microphone? Next one is Paul Seabright. Paul, please.
Thank you very much. One of the scary things about participating in panels when you get to my age is remembering what I wrote on the subject 3 or 4 weeks ago. Now, the great thing about participating in a panel on AI is that the world is changing so fast that it may not matter. I think I wrote something which would reconcile these two perspectives, and I certainly meant to write something to say that if AI is speeding up massively the rate at which new innovations and new utilizations of innovations are arriving, this is a matter of speed, but many of the challenges are ones we've seen before. So I talk about quite a lot of historical analogies, including the invention of the printing press. Now, when I was starting up economics a very long time ago, I learned 2 concepts which I rapidly thought would go out of date, but which have turned out to be astonishingly relevant even today. The difference between substitute products and complementary products. And the point about substitute products, definition being that when the price of one rises, the demand for the other one rises, is that you can say that a merger between the producers of 2 substitute products is a bad thing because it's going to raise prices and perhaps also degrade innovation and so on. So if there are 2 producers of doors in a town, only 2 producers, they have a merger, well, it's very easy, you can ban it. It's what you might even call an open and shut case. Now, if instead you have a producer of doors and a producer of door handles, well, you can be relaxed about that because these are complementary products. When the price of one goes up, the demand for the other one falls, so that you know that the producer of doors is going to have an incentive actually to make the door handles cheaper and more effectively work with the doors. Very easy. And of course, you know, when I was first doing sort of industrial organization, we would use cases like, you know, merger between the 2 members of the salt duopoly, and that was easy. See? So, but of course, you know, the real world is not like that, and it hasn't been for a very long time, because in almost any ecosystem, you will have firms that are producing a bunch of things. Some of them are complementary, some of them are substitutability. Any other firm they merge with or have a deal with is going to be producing some stuff that's complementary to some of the other stuff. And so it's very easy to sort of, in the face of that, think either you give up, or what you do is you hire a few smart economists to produce a fancy model of why this particular merger is going to result in a net impact on balance negative if the economist is hired by the agency, or on balance positive if they're hired by the parties. And I confess to having made a really comfortable sideline for a certain number of years in my career and doing exactly that kind of thing. But it's not terribly insightful in the longer run. And so the question is, can you say anything systematic? And I think what I would say really comes, puts into relief the things we've heard, and perhaps Jason doesn't want to hear this, but in a way that I think reconciles very, very closely the things that the 2 of you were saying. And it's the idea that you need, in an ecosystem, to see whether anybody has got their hands on a bottleneck resource. And the point about bottleneck resource is that only rarely do they remain bottlenecks for long, because the supply curves are often strikingly elastic. Okay. Now, one of the reasons I raised the question about TSMC and China and so on is that it seems to me that in this particular ecosystem, probably only those kinds of chips are likely to remain bottleneck resources for long. I don't even know how long, but those are the ones I worry about, and I don't think that has anything to do with what merger authorities. I mean, this is a real geopolitical, strategic issue, which I don't want to go into right now. But for the rest, I'm entirely with Jason that I think most of the sources of what economists call quasi-rents, which are the rents that arise to innovation in the short run, are actually to do with particular human competences which occur in sort of all sorts of strange teams. Some of them are individuals sitting in their own office trying to figure out ways to become more productive without the boss realizing that this was largely due to the use of GPT-4. But some of them are just groups of people getting together. It's out there in the ecosystem, and the point is most of these things will generate quasi-rents, but they're not going to generate long-run rents, because just the whole thing is so chaotic that whatever you do, if you make enough money for enough time, there are going to be people out there envious of what you're earning, putting together rival teams, including perhaps some of your collaborators, who, although they expressed undying loyalty to you when they started the project, will quickly move to somebody else. So I'm actually not worried about all of that. What I did do, though, in the contribution was to talk about the downstream impacts on users. And here again, the notion of complements and substitutes really matters. Most of the people developing these innovations are developing them to make them complementary to their own work. So it's pretty clear that most of the people putting in the innovative effort are going to benefit from this. The question is, are they going to benefit at anybody else's expense? And therefore, we need to try and look for those externalities. And I think the main message that I gave, at least in the first part of my contribution, was that if the use of generative AI makes people able to do bad stuff to other people, it's not going to be a new kind of bad stuff. It's going to be the same old bad stuff, which they just do a bit more efficiently than they did before. What are the kinds of bad stuff we're thinking about? We're thinking about drones killing people in Ukraine right now. We're thinking about people undermining the work of others, or maybe spreading false information about it. But, listening to the deepfake stuff this morning, which was fascinating, I was thinking deepfake stuff has been around for a long time. And indeed, as somebody who works, as you kindly pointed out, on religion, I was intrigued the other day to see an anguished discussion in India where people were saying, with deepfakes, how do we know whether the messages coming from the god Krishna are true or not? And obviously my reaction to that was, I don't have a horse in this race, and I'm not going to try and say what are the true messages from Krishna. But what I can tell you is this is not the first time in history this question has been asked. So we've been asking these questions about, what's true and what's false. And I think the overall message is, overwhelmingly, if people are going to use AI to do bad things, it's the same bad things that they've been doing for centuries and millennia. They may just do them a little bit more efficiently. And so we shouldn't be trying to invent artificial and imaginary new bad things. It's the old bad things. And so we need to think about what was effective in constraining the old bad things and how might that work too. I have a brief bit at the end about existential risk, which is, I don't have time to talk about it now, but read it if you're interested in and scared by existential risk. If you don't lie awake at night thinking about existential risk, don't bother.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thanks also for linking your comments to the comments made by Jason and by Ella. Next is Bill, my co-author on this piece.
Yes, so this is a real honor to be here, and it's really fun. And it's nice that, one of the points is evidenced by my name, William, so I'm last, but Bill is what I'm normally called, so I could have been first. And that's sort of the fact that I think one of the things we're moving towards in the world and the technology, what the technology's done is it allows us tons and tons of options. And so from a technical point of view, when I talk to the engineers, there's always ways to make each of the technologies better, but increasingly the options of what we do are going to be governed by economics. And so I sit as an economist in the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence lab, and I'm like the dog who doesn't understand most of what they're talking about, but gets like the, bark, bark, walk, bark, bark, food, and I understand there's something that's important there. And sort of what I've been trying to do is sort of get people, the engineers, to sort of think more about policy and economics aware technology design. And that turns out to be really, really hard. But the other thing I do, and like Paul here, I've made money doing, is explaining to the other people how to do technology-aware policy and economics. Which there's lots of ways to do that. So I find myself in violent agreement with everything all of my co-speakers have said, and so in some sense, it's sort of figuring out what did we write about in our paper that is sort of different and new, and I think. In some sense, it's an evangelical point. We're arguing for the need to build a measurement ecosystem. So we agree that the idea is that it's at least worth considering that AI is a general purpose technology. And that, if that is a general purpose technology of the scale to drive a fourth industrial revolution, then what we know that means is that everything will change. Because you look at all the earlier revolutions and you say, what happened before them, the world was really, really different in almost every way afterwards. And that took a long time to play out. And so that's the kind of environment where I think we're in. And in that kind of environment, we don't know where we're going. So there's fundamental uncertainty, which we have to deal with in making our decision making. And we know there's going to be a lot of path dependency, and we know that we're going to need to make adaptations how we go. So the big question, which we don't answer in our paper, is how do you have regulatory policies in a very complex system, dynamic complexity environment. And so obviously one of the things you have to have in an environment like that is you have to have a lot of measurement. Now, a bunch of what the paper talks about is we talk about positive feedback loops. And those positive feedback loops across the value chain, that's been sort of standard, the notion that, innovation at one level of the value chain feeds to innovation at other levels, and that sometimes it can happen at one level and it goes back, sometimes it happens at other level. What's true about the new environment is it's going in both directions really fast, and the ability to restructure the value chain because of the technological options is continuous. So the question of you can create new feedback loops, or if you don't like, for example, regulation, and you can engineer around it. So like if I'm a platform provider and someone regulates that, I could then say, okay, well, I'm just going to move to a different place because the technology allows me to move the functionality around in ways. And I think the simple way when I think about AI is like a future vision. So AI is this future vision of basically to enable Smart X. Now, we've had Smart X for a really long time, and almost all Smart X that exists today doesn't require AI, isn't mostly AI, and most of that will be true even in the future. So the AI is, changing that. It's making it easier to adopt, more places, all that sort of stuff. But it's heading towards a horizon of where it's a principle we could automate any task anywhere. And that means at any kind of fractal level of identity, you can think the task is the structure of the value chain. You can think about the task as the structure of firms or industries, or you can think about the task as the structure of your job, the balance between your private life and your social life. So in that sense, you could use the thinking of that at any level. Those applications have to run on basic infrastructure. And so the other thing we talk about 6G, which is just the future mix of all the connectivity, the computing devices that have to be hooked up, with broadband policy. And most of that, the design of that has been the concern of telecommunications regulators. And a lot of the intellectual sort of motivation that's taken me in this direction is understanding and thinking about that regulation and the fact that the AI, it's a microcosm. And sort of the high level ideas, like I was thinking, the AI Act bothers me. Anouk said that, she didn't say that it's wrong, but maybe it's premature. That's very much captures my view on this. And that I think that what needs a better model is to go from the various sectors. So like, for example, MIT came out with a policy position paper that said, we ought to start with the idea that if there's something that's illegal or dangerous or bad for a human to do, that a machine shouldn't be allowed to do it either. And so then you say, okay, well, if something bad's happening and a machine looks like they're doing it, who would be stopping the humans? If it's in Securities and Finance, then in the U.S., that's the Securities and Exchange Commission. If it's something in healthcare, then it's the people that regulate that kind of stuff. And then we ought to start from there and then ask ourselves, if those agencies can't figure out what to do with AI and we need the general regulation, then that's a good thing. And I think that's sort of what we would want to do in the U.S. That was the question I asked earlier about what was it? The way we do things in the U.S. So the way things in the U.S., where it's a common law foundation and that sort of experimentation, totally makes sense. And I'm interested in sort of how that's different in Europe. And I've already run over, so let me stop there.
It's fine, Bill.
Okay.
If you need a bit more, can you hand this already to Paul? So, thank you, everyone, for this intro statements. I think you also had some analytical content already, which is great, also perhaps to inform the discussion with the audience in a second. But before we do that, let's talk a bit more about the economics of generative AI and whether or to what extent like this requires us to reassess, let's say, conventional economic wisdom. Some of you, let's say, touched on this already, but let's be a bit more concrete. So I've prepared some questions for each of you where we can dive a bit deeper. And Paul, let's start with you. In your contribution, you explored a link, you mentioned a link between market structure features, right, and different AI risks. You mentioned it, the existential risks, but also the ecosystem risks. Two brief questions. Can you briefly elaborate on whether or how Gen AI and the risks you explain there require us to abandon, to some extent at least, the conventional economic wisdom on this? And more specifically, some experts, right, believe that there are existential risks associated with Gen AI that are different to any other technology perhaps we had in the ICT sphere, let's say. Do you think this makes it, or is this a difference that makes a difference, that requires the reassessment? Okay, it was a no, a clear no.
Yeah. Yeah, no, so my answer is no. Do you want me to elaborate?
Very quickly,
no,
why?
Sorry,
very quickly, just as very good.
Here's why. And again, actually, I'd like to go back to Jason's point. Most innovation, but I think this isn't new to AI. I think it's just very, very true of AI. Most innovation in the knowledge sphere is a collaboration between what you might call, for the purposes of the exercise, the producer of the innovation and the user of the innovation, okay? There are almost no knowledge innovations which don't have that participative character. I mean, I see this in the classroom all the time. And, you know, my students, they come in and they know perfectly well that most of what they learn involves a large investment from them, and they learn from each other. And I'm just the kind of parrot in the front of the hall that is getting them to think. But most of the real work is done by them thinking. So obviously it's true that when we apply our workhorse economic concepts, like the difference between substitute products and complementary products, we're applying them in uses where the people who are feeding us the kind of deep, hard details of the uses are contributing to that interpretation of the concepts of substitutes and complements. But the concepts remain the same. And I'm just astonished. You know, as I say, I was convinced 40 years ago that within 10 years of my learning them, they would be obsolete. They're more relevant than ever. So I think that's the main answer to your question. I can't remember if there was a second question, but that's it.
A second question. Okay. And this is a bit different. This refers to a paradox you mentioned. And you suggest basically something like, if I recall correctly, there's some market power, but not too much might be best. So this is basically market power to ensure responsible insiders, but not enough to threaten cartel abuses. So can you briefly explain this paradox and basically elaborate on how you think policymakers might best navigate the balancing act, and what tools from us or we can as academics deliver to inform that and facilitate the efforts?
Okay, so this actually also relates to what I said about existential risk, where I said that I think most of the immediate terror of existential risk is overblown, because most AIs, if they're to create existential risk for us, have to act in the world, and that means they have to be connected up to stuff that does bad things to us. You know, an LLM may fantasize about killing us, but in order to kill us, it has to be connected up to some hardware that can do that, okay? Now, the point I wanted to make was that even if you connect up an AI to a 3D printer, typically for the stuff that the 3D printer produces, there's usually going to be some rather scarce physical resources, for example, chips or you know, rare earths or whatever it might be. And so that again, the bottleneck resource for either an AI that has gone rogue or a person that is using an AI for bad purposes is not the innovation in the purely informational sense, but the connectivity to all of the stuff, that supply chain that is generating, for example, the drone. And, you know, it's not, the drone is not just its software, it's also a piece of hardware, and the hardware actually, I would suggest, involves many more bottlenecks than the software does. So yes, there are real dangers. I mean, people have been using innovation technology to do terrible things to each other, torture and kill each other for thousands of years, and I talk a little bit about that in my paper. And they are still going to go doing that. And again, look at drones in Ukraine right now. This is really number one issue we should, I mean, drones and nuclear weapons are, but the point about what those, enables those to proliferate is that it's least as much to do with connectivity to sophisticated supply chains, including hardware and components and rare earths and whatever, as it is to the actual software.
May I ask you for the microphone? Yeah. Thank you, because we only have these two. Thank you. Ella, you're next. So your analysis, if I understood correctly, like suggests in a way that managing competition among the vertical ecosystems you describe and substantiate empirically may be more pro-competitive than seeking to eliminate or undermine their existence, while acknowledging that regulatory oversight to protect against tipping or winner-takes-all outcomes may be needed. Now, you mention how regulatory efforts to counter the adverse impacts of market power by promoting interoperability that enables mix and match competition can have the perverse effect of weakening investment and competition among vertical ecosystems. What guidance can you offer policymakers on that point?
My guidance would be very, very careful with imposing interconnectivity to market players, because interconnectivity, mandating interconnectivity can have effects that are good, but also effects that are bad, especially in the situation of the market where it is now, where there is so much innovation and things are still moving very quickly in the direction which we don't know. And these effects, the different effects, depend a little bit on whether we are talking about horizontal interconnectivity or vertical interconnectivity. So let's start with horizontal interconnectivity or interoperability. I'm not sure if there is a difference, but let's just imagine, so how would this work? Let's say I develop a large language model, and a user using another large language model could write a prompt and get also an answer from my model. So there would be the different large language models would somehow work together. That would be great for lowering the barriers to entry for for new language models, because then they could use the users who are already working with using other language models. That would be fantastic. There would be maybe more competition at the level of large language models. You could maybe hope that in this way tipping is less likely, because there will be more options available. But at the same time, as a user, if you can have access to all the available large language models by writing a prompt only in one, then you would single home. You would have no incentive to download the app of each and every large language model. You would just be with one, and you would simply use the services of the others through that one. And this is something that makes tipping more likely and not less likely. So this would be the effect that would work against competition, more competition. In addition, if models were interconnected in this way, and I, as a user, write a prompt and can compare the answers from different models, the models would have the incentives of the model developers would have the incentive to compete on the certain parameters that are directly visible, and they would maybe not distinguish themselves in other dimensions that can be not compared via a single prompt. And therefore, maybe there would be less variety, because models would have an incentive to become very similar. An example of this comes from the Digital Markets Act, which now imposes interoperability at the request. An entrant can request interoperability with a gatekeeper's digital service. And we have, for example, WhatsApp as a gatekeeper, and surprise, surprise, another smaller app for chatting, Signal, it actually doesn't want it. It doesn't want to connect with WhatsApp, because then it will become more similar to WhatsApp, And then maybe most of users who now multi-home and have both Signal and WhatsApp would just delete Signal. There is no point of having Signal if all apps are interconnected. So there are perverse effects that work against more competition as the result of horizontal interoperability.
How much should we be scared of tipping even if it happens? I mean, how long would it last?
Well, Google, I don't know, but Google search market has tipped to Google, and Google is quite powerful, has many competition authorities on their back, and it doesn't seem to go away. Maybe it goes away with large language models. Maybe they will replace Google search. But it has been there already for many years and has earned a lot of money on this. Is this not a reason to?
This is right in the middle of this. So bottlenecks, you might want to add a bottleneck, right, if it's a competitive harm, right? But we have, in this area where things are moving so fast, for example, if the expectation of tipping is too fast because industry will self-correct it, but it costs a lot to make the investment, then I'll never make it. That's why we protected the monopolies with the telecom guys in the first case. And in this space, one of the questions is, what is the right level of public investment? Like, where would they create the shared resources that everybody would take advantage of? And of course, if it is a shared resource that everybody's taking advantage of, then you have a bottleneck risk. So this problem, it'll be the bottlenecks you want to create, and then the bottlenecks that exist that you don't need to regulate because they're going away. And I think that's more the problem. So I sort of see you guys in some sense in violent agreement, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I think we're in agreement about what would matter, and I'm sure Elżbieta doesn't think that the fact of having somebody with 93% or whatever it is market share is intrinsically the problem, is what you worry about for the space of innovation and so forth. My general sense is that in this space, we've had some large market shares that have lasted a long time and others that have been rapidly competed away. And generally, where they're the ones that have lasted a long time, it's because the risk of being competed away has been sufficiently real that the incumbents have had to move fast. But I may be considered too much of an optimist in this, and I'd be interested to know whether you think that the particular tipping risks we might face in the artificial intelligence space really would involve being able to capture a bottleneck resource that would persist.
I don't know. To be honest, I have no crystal ball. I think the one important thing is that it's not easy to enter this market, so it's not easy to challenge someone who has already a huge market share. And if there was a positive feedback loop and users were simply favoring a certain provider, of course, I have no problem with that. But it would be very difficult to challenge such a provider, because the cost which you have to incur to have access to the computing power, to the data, to the chips, is enormous in this business. And then on top of that, you have the network effects on the demand side, and it's not obvious how to work against them.
Maybe, Bill, maybe some you can connect these insights and discussions to stuff relating to modularity, vertical integration, and that stuff. And the work you had with David Clark, I think Casey Cleffy was on this as well, the regulation of layered platforms. If we see the bottlenecks in the vertically complementary constellation and configuration, can you elaborate on this a bit?
Sure. I mean, we wrote an earlier paper back in 2019 that was trying to bring together work that David Clark had done with Casey Claffey on using some of the management theory about how platforms make use of shared stuff and build on that. and work I had done on thinking about, what a telecom regulatory authority needs to do in a world where the things they're focusing on aren't really where necessarily the problems exist, and they need to evolve. And the idea is that basically we said a lot of the focus was on, and Ella talks about this a lot in her paper, was on individual market power situations at particular layers, like Google in search, Amazon in product things. And the fact is that all of those big players, all the GAN-FAM guys, all operate ecosystems of platforms. And so acting at any particular layer is like pushing on a more complicated waterbed. It's going to have all kinds of other effects. And from a U.S., Europe versus China kind of perspective, damaging the ecosystem of competition, that's an issue we haven't really talked about. But even within that, an acting on any individual one would mitigate, and that a lot of the best benefit was these platforms competing against each other. And so, what do you do about that from a regulatory point of view? Well, you try to sort of regulate those guys in some sort of soft-handed way, and that's where we need the measurement thing. And then linking back to the paper, because I didn't say this really, and I probably should have, one of the feedback loops that's really important that we talk about, and why it's a telecom sector-specific issue, is the infrastructure, which Paul was talking about, the hardware, all that kind of stuff. Well, all of those visions of what they're trying to build, like modern networks, the next generation networks are converged, they're using all kinds of spectrum, they're both edge and core networks and all that sort of stuff. There's a bunch of stuff that's been happening there. Basically, you can't do any of that stuff going forward without having a lot of those resources shared, every resource shared. And that's really what telecom networks are all about, multiplexing, shared capacity. So you provision for the peak and then you share it across multiple users. That's now true at all levels of the stack. And to manage that, you can't do that without AI. So you can't build the future networks without AI and all that sort of computing everywhere stuff. That if that doesn't exist, then the AI doesn't exist, because it doesn't have any way to get there. It's like in some lab sitting there, but it can't actually affect the real world. So the demand, that vision of what they're building and all that sort of stuff, which now at the 6G, the 3GPP, there's a lot of people in the telecom sector that are like, we still haven't gotten the money back for 4G, so we're kind of like, why are you going to do this? So it's resting on the fact that AI needs all this computes. And also, all these computes are necessary for sustainability. So everybody's loving that kind of message. That's sort of the World Economic Forum thing. And I think it's a lot of truth to it. But the other piece is this thing that the actual measurement infrastructure is also true. So the government's role in this, in the bottleneck question, is the government's sitting there on the side. It doesn't know what to do because it can't know what to do, but it needs to have the capacity to basically deal with the problem. So can we anticipate what the problems might be? So there will be problems. There may be bottlenecks that need to get created. So subsidized stuff. Broadband isn't in the right places. Broadband connectivity isn't really the issue for infrastructure. The issue for infrastructure is going to be computing resources. So what is the role about subsidizing computing resources at the edge, and what are good ways to do that versus bad ways to do that? That's the kind of infrastructure policy thing. To manage those networks with AI, you're going to build in a ton of measurement capabilities. You can't share in a really dynamic way unless you have a lot of real-time measurement capability. So the actual infrastructure for doing the measurements, collecting the stuff, the sensing, all of that stuff is going to be part of that fabric of the 6G networks. What you do with that is obviously going to have huge implications for market power and everything else. So all the people in that distributed world are going to anticipate when you start talking about measurements and what you want, who has to disclose what or mandate, they're going to think, like, okay, this is a standard, am I going to do that or not? And we have to develop the metrics so that we can compare technical things and then integrate them with economic stuff. That takes capacity. So we're going to need engineers and lawyers certainly in the room having that debate. I hope we have economists in the room, but if you start kicking people out of the room, you kick the economists out first, then you kick the lawyers out, and then you kick the engineers, because you can't do anything without the engineers, and the lawyers won't ever let you kick them out of the room, so that's not really an option.
Well, thank you, Bill. Zooming out a bit, maybe, Jason. Coming back to the hyper capabilities concept, how does this relate, to this sort of vertical integration discussion and the consolidation tendencies we have heard now from previous speakers we see in upstream parts of the value chain? Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, thank you. So the basic hyper capabilities argument was addressed to competition policy regulators to give them an answer to the question, what should we be targeting? But let me be more concrete and also go back to trying to answer the question about bottlenecks. So my theory is that the bottlenecks in Gen AI are not in Gen AI. I'll give you 2 places where I think they are. So the first one is energy. So the main thing that you need to do if you're going to build large-scale Gen AI foundation models is you do a lot of compute. Compute is made of 2 inputs, chips, which come from several places, and they're super profitable to make if you've got many billions of dollars, but there is competition in that market. Then you need put those chips into a data center. Then you need to plug that data center into something that has got the equivalent of a power grid of a small province or nation. Good luck building a 10 megawatt power station that you need by Tuesday. Right? At the moment, the main barriers to that are environmental regulations on the processing of a new 10 to 20 megawatt power station that will power your thing to train your model, and that's the reason that the trained model costs $400 million, is you have to factor in the chips I can get by next year, maybe, might have to invade a country, possibly, but there is no way I'm getting that power plant before 2040. I have a sort of theory that the best source of these power plants at the moment is nuclear submarines that you can just park up next to a data center. But just the point there is that these are the lead time on next-gen trained AI models that are sort of $1 billion each isn't Taiwan. It's the regulatory environment that enables you to very rapidly build a new nuclear reactor to put next to it. So first of all, this Gen AI isn't about Gen AI. It's about other sectors. So one, if you care about competition in Gen AI, you need massive reform in your environmental policies and energy policies. Where's that going to come from? Not the US, not EU. This is a huge opportunity for places that aren't those places. Secondly, Gen AI has 2 major issues, problems, challenges. One, I kind of prefer the term non-deterministic compute rather than Gen AI. What a Gen AI model does is it's a compute model that, unlike classic computing, generates a predictable outcome that if I run it again, I'll get the same result. It's non-deterministic compute. If I keep pushing, do it again, I'll get slightly different results. The popular term for that is hallucination. It's seen as bad. The correct response is non-deterministic compute. That's why it is smart. Right? That's a feature. The problem with the value of that is that I can't use non-deterministic compute to do things that I want to do, such as the obvious main use case of Gen AI, which is software agents. I want it to be an agent on my behalf. I want to plug it into my bank account or my email, and I want it to go out in the world and pretend to be me. I want it to make trades. I want it to answer things. I want it to do all those things because it's trained on me. Why can't I do that? Because it's non-deterministic compute. It'll sometimes do crazy things like that. No way, I would not have done that. Well, sometimes, but then then I walk it back. At the moment, the context of how we think about making that safe, that massive trillion-dollar market of AI agents safe, is we put regulatory environments over the companies that build them. That is not going to work because this lives in the world. If we've got a software-based technology, we need software-based governance. This is Larry Lessig, right? You govern with code. Where do we find that deterministic compute? Smart contracts. What is blockchain smart contracts? Just deterministic compute. So the one way of sort of building this creating the value in this new technology is to take an AI agent and then wrap it in smart contracts, and what you now have is a safe agent that will only do what the smart contracts allow. Now the law can guide what those smart contracts are, can make suggestions about it, but that's a vision of what the future might look like with that. The other one, sort of in terms of hyper capabilities, is ownership. So at the moment, the main constraint on Gen AI is that it has to be owned by corporations. And the reason for that is the massive amount of capital involved in it, and also we need someone to take responsibility. There's an alternative. That alternative is trusts, like data trusts or other sort of ways of a community of data providers to collectively own it. The law is difficult there. It's not designed. Trusts aren't designed to be corporate, to deploy capital and make risky decisions. They're designed to hold things and be safe. But where we've got massive advances in new types of trust technologies is, again, in blockchain. These are called DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. What a DAO is a way for a group of people, a community, to use token-gated governance to collectively own a resource, such as data, and then make payments on that using tokens back to it. So the point there is, that's an example of what I mean by sort of a hyper capability, a new institutional technology that enables this technology stack, AI, to exist in a world that is bigger than individual countries or has sort of people coming and going into it, but is still governed by something, in the sense that it's governed by code plus token-gated feedback and ownership and so on. So that, I mean, the point of that story is that's Gen AI plus smart contracts or blockchain is the relevant scope of what we might sort of see as the institutional types of things that will exist. Now there, the relevant thing is, that's why token law matters to this space, because that's the fundamental constraint on the building of the institutions for Gen AI. So again, these technologies are massively interdependent.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I think we've covered lots of perspectives, and it's a great point to hand over and ask the audience for questions. I think lots of points to connect. Thibault, could you? With microphone.
Thank you all. It was super interesting listening to this panel. So I have two questions. So one for Bill and Volker. So how do you reconcile your call for more evidence gathering and creation of metrics, and your assessment that to which I'm very sympathetic, and your assessment that the AI Act may be premature, with your acknowledging path dependencies in this field and the rapid accelerated development, which may render any intervention ineffective by the time we develop the metrics and gather the evidence?
Well, I think we want to have approach on many different levels. So what Jason just talked about with smart contracts, I call smart contracts the technology to do the automation of automation. There's a research question what we mean by that and all that. So we can have all that. But my thing about pushing, like why I focused on competition policy by focusing on telecommunications regulation in our paper, which you could have focused on SEC regulation, healthcare regulation, any of them. They all ought to do it. Because that's, those guys are the guys that kind of know, oh, I've got a problem in securities. What is it I need to do? Like, what do I need to know? And how can AI help me? They will have to use AI to help themselves. And then from those experiments and what works, hopefully, will basically, it'll be a dialogue with the academics, the policymakers, and the capacity has to be there. So all of the agencies have to have people that actually will know how to use AI. So the first thing they have to do is they have to hire people. Big data analysts are different than standard statistics. The way we teach econometrics to economists is no longer right. We have to change that. That's the thing. At MIT, we've invented this College of Computing. I'm not sure what they're going to do there. But it's a recognition that computer science is about more. And how they're trying to engineer that. And so when I've talked about, it's like building a capacity. So when I thought about regulators, I was like, put the guys in the room, have them have a discussion, ask them what's the information they don't need. So like Volker and I are working with folks that are trying to do broadband mobile measurements. And we're talking to some computer scientists about, are there standards for the way they define coverage or jitter or anything else in the national regulations that are not completely consistent? We know that's true. We just want to find a good experiment and then demonstrate how using average data is going to get you really bad, misleading evidence to point you to when you need more granular data and when you don't. And one of the things that we need in the purely technical thing we've called for is an algebra of measurement. So if I measure something like I want to know what the end-to-end latency is, I have to measure it on the various links. If I get those measurements from different sources and I add them up, I can't just add them up. Now that's a problem technically. If I then say, what is the economic implications of improving latency end-to-end, that's like, you talk to the engineers, it's like really hard. they're like, oh, well, what would it cost me if I do this technology? Well, that technology is always competing against the other technology, which is like what already exists. And I can't estimate that. So the first thing is build the capacity, have these detailed dialogues. That's very practical. And there are answers I might have if you ask a very narrow, specific question. But, I think like the rules, like earlier there was a question about, do we need more tools? No, I don't think we need more tools. We need more expertise to use the tools we currently have.
Okay, so to Jason, I'm curious if the relevant paradigm today is user innovation, Van Hippel paradigm, then how do we cultivate this ecosystem where user innovation can scale, not just thrive, but also scale to benefit society at large?
Yeah, that is the right question. So the problem with user innovation, the reason that producer innovation succeeds in industrial economies is that it scales. How does it scale? Firms and markets. That's the environment. The input into user innovation is local information, local knowledge. The user knows the problem they're trying to solve. They have a lot of very specific information about the capabilities in front of them. The producer doesn't have that. The producer has to sort of guess. That's what entrepreneurship is. I think this is the problem you're trying to solve. Here's the standard solution to it. All right, so what does scaling look like? Scaling would be a technology. Imagine a technology that enabled people to communicate and upload information to others at low cost that could then be used by others and downloaded. All right, so that's kind of the internet. It's limited by my willingness to describe this and put it into, that's now I'm talking about Reddit or something like that. So we kind of have the technology, but the scaling factor here is incentives. I might have figured out a nice little sort of way to solve a particular problem, say, within personalizing a medical device, for instance, for me because of my very special situation. It's only by my goodwill that I will then write that down so that others might find it. Search engines will facilitate the finding. Databases will facilitate the recording of it, and some sort of small costs of maintaining that system. So, I've been we've been thinking about so the question, what does policy do here? Okay, so one technology here is tax policy. You can kind of create incentives for people, sort of tax rebates if you sort of behave in this particular way. Another way is you sort of subsidize the companies that are doing that, or whatever. You create prizes. You create, there's a menu of sort of different ways to potentially solve that. All of them are, okay-ish. There's no perfect solution there. But I think just recognizing that what the problem here is, we've got the technologies to create, just to scale the diffusion of local information about innovation to others. The things that stand in the way, GDPR, major problem. Any sort of any information that punishes the leakage of information or possibly existence of who did what when. So a lot of obsessions with the benefits of privacy cut against the benefits of sharing. Right? So again, there's just trade-offs here. I'm not saying privacy is a bad thing. I'm just saying that a lot of regulatory focus on that has come at the cost of low-cost sharing of information. So within firms, the challenge here is that I discover something fun and interesting about my job at GBP. I have no incentive to tell any of my coworkers or anyone above, right? So again, the problem here is just how do you design incentives to pull that information up, to codify that information so it can be indexed and discovered by others and push it sideways. Hard problem. I wish I knew, but that's the problem. I mean, I'm just emphasizing that that's the right question because that's the hard problem. How do we scale commons? And open source software managed to do it by just linking communities together, and computer scientists are just unusually lovely people. They're willing to share, but they're willing to share around common problems that they're trying to solve. So, I mean, my framing of this is just Elinor Ostrom. We know that this problem can be solved in theory. We know in practice it sometimes is solved with very particular governance rules. we know that those rules generally don't scale very well, except when they do. So I think that sort of challenge of sort of seeing this as the role of public policy is just not to get in the way of that, or not to do things that will accidentally, and no policy is ever deliberately trying to harm this, but there's a lot of sort of unintended consequences where in the writing of this law, we've just suddenly made it very risky to share information because of liability or because of whatever. Again, I think that's the challenge we have right now. And I don't know whether this is a public problem or a private problem, whether some companies will try and do this. At various times, different companies have built platforms for this or have sort of worked in this way. But
Can I have a follow-up? Because there's another type of scaling that is needed. If imagine your user had a fantastic idea and there is a new AI application, I don't know, let's say for doctors to do a diagnosis of a certain illness, and all of a sudden it's so good that all doctors in this area around the world want to use it. And then you have to also be able to scale the processing of giving the answers via the LLM. And you need a lot of processing power. As you said yourself, you need a lot of electricity. And for this type of scale, you need these big tech incumbents or someone with deep pockets who is able to invest in into the infrastructure and provide it. It's not just about the idea for the application, it's also about servicing this application.
You know, scaling is so central that I wish someone who called a podcast Scaling Theory, available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.
Thank you. This has been super interesting to listen to. My name is Beatriz Botero and I teach at SCIENSPO. I am not an economist, so I hope this isn't totally ridiculous. But I have two questions, maybe. One's for Jason, I guess, but maybe most of you can chip in. So I thought it was very interesting how you described like the innovation at the kind of consumer type of layer, how that's very important. But I wonder how we should deal, or how you think we should deal with the production side of it and the, I don't want to say monopolies because you're all economists, but like the incumbents there. And I'm thinking about other examples of commons economies where even if they're open commons and they're digital commons, there's been some co-optation of largest actors. So I imagine there's, like, even if there's a bunch of people innovating with open source models or like Llama, for example, there will be some form of power and direction exercised by maybe the people that first developed these models, and I wonder how you think about that. Or maybe it isn't a problem. I guess part of the things we're trying to figure out is exactly what are the issues we should focus on. And then my other question, which I guess it's something that Bill, you mentioned, is that so I'm very interested in the sectorial approach that you described in the US. I'm not a big fan of the AI Act or what I've read because I haven't read the final version, but I think the story in the US with privacy regulation is that the sectorial approach kind of fell short. And it's kind of paradoxical because it was the US that first developed the privacy principles that then inspired the OECD and then inspired European data protection law. But it seems that like with these type of technologies that spread so widely, focusing on the sectors in the privacy case, which is something that happened 40 years ago or something, left too many unregulated buckets that led to a surveillance complex that may or may not be problematic depending on where you stand. But yeah, I'm curious on whether you think there's something to learn there or maybe it's too early to tell. Sorry for the long...
All right, quick answer. Axiom 1, all supply curves are elastic in the long run. This is absolutely true of Gen AI, except where they are regulatory stopped from being so. Right? And the classic example of this is banking and bank licenses. Right? Banking would be highly competitive except there are bank licenses, and thus those rents exist for centuries. My answer here is the economics of public choice. I'm channeling George Stigler right now. The main thing I would do is, I'm generally not, I know there are large companies, I know there are bazillions of dollars spent in fixed costs, which is classically points to monopoly. I, again, worship at the temple of Weizenbaum here. These are all contestable rents. They will eventually go away unless regulation stops them going away. So my main sort of, if I had a magic pen and could make things happen, what I would do is every time there is an inquiry that seeks to call the companies before the regulatory agencies and seeks to regulate them, and the companies, well, oh, please don't regulate me, but they want to be regulated, right? They want it more than anything else in the world. Because what it does is it blocks competition. It blocks the new entrants coming in. Regulation locks in business models. The situation we have right now is all of the big AI companies are trying to figure out, how do I make money out of this? And they've all got their conjectures about that. But behind each of those conjectures is a business model. The purpose of the regulation that they want is to lock in that business model because they're the best at doing that, and others will find it hard to compete. So I just want very skeptical regulators, is my wish.
Thanks very much. Beatrice, is it fine if you guys can discuss after the panel to German timekeeping and all that stuff? And we can follow up then after this. And we go to the bonus questions because we only have a few minutes left. Bonus questions. Ella, we start with you. Do we have another mic? Yep. Can you bring it? Okay. Ella, if you became the chief economist at DG Competition on Monday, what would be your first move you'd make regarding Gen AI?
I would hire 15 data scientists who have worked on LLM models, and I would involve them in every single initiative of regulating, or maybe not regulating, that's not what DigiComp does, but going after abuse of market power.
Okay, thank you very much. Jason, you're next. Computer scarce, could be due to energy. Assume there are only a few working GPUs available on this planet and you can use them. Would you use them for Gen AI or for crypto mining?
I would use them for crypto mining to make all of the money that I could then reinvest into Gen AI.
Wonderful, thank you. Can you give us a Paul? Very quick question. Which are the 3 economists you would suggest as chief economist at DG Competition? You could be one of them.
I wouldn't do it if you paid me a very large sum of money. No, I mean, seriously, I think that you can't take that job without buying into a certain view of what the problem is. I don't buy into that view. I don't know what my alternative is, but I want to be able to think about it creatively without being forced to toe the party line. There are lots of people who will do the good job, but when they announce that they're prepared to do the good job, they're already revealing something about themselves which makes me want to challenge them.
Very good answer. Bill, your last.
Okay.
Tomorrow we will be hanging out at Wannsee perhaps, and you receive a phone call from a US public official asking for your advice on whether the US should adopt the EU's AI Act, like basically almost literally. What would you tell them?
I would, well, I mean, basically I would say wave the flag that you would do exactly what the White House did. Wave the flag and say you aspire to all those things and do precisely nothing. Because right now we don't really know, but I believe, as Stephen was saying, there is progress, and at least meaning that the questions and the issues and what we're trying to address make sense. But to have legislation in the U.S. context today would be a disaster.
Thank you very much. Session is closed. Thanks, everyone. We have lunch. Thanks.